Hi, I'm glad you could join me in my study. We've been thinking about the coherence of the doctrine of penal substitution. That is to say, the doctrine that God afflicted Christ with the suffering that we deserved as the punishment for our sins. Let's review now what we've seen so far. First of all, I argued that the penal substitution theorist does not need to maintain that God, in fact, punished Christ. It's sufficient for penal substitution to say that God inflicted the suffering on Christ, which would have been punishment had it been inflicted on us instead. So that penal substitution does not, in fact, require us to say that God punished Christ. But secondly, we saw that if we do want to affirm that God punished Christ for our sins, this is not incompatible with expressivism, because expressivism simply maintains that the act of wrongdoing or the wrongdoer himself is condemned for his action. It doesn't require that the penal substitution be the target of the attitude of condemnation. And finally, we saw that if the theory of expressivism or an expressivist theory of punishment is incompatible with penal substitution, then the penal substitution theorist can simply reject that theory of punishment. It's not incumbent upon him. Now, so far, we've assumed that God does not, in fact, condemn Christ. But is that true? Well, if you hold to the traditional Reformation doctrine of the imputation of sins, then God, in fact, does condemn Christ because our sins are imputed to Christ, and therefore God's wrath and just judgment falls upon Christ for those sins. So, in fact, if you hold to the classical doctrine of the imputation of sins, there's simply no problem whatsoever in saying that God punished Christ for our sins and condemned Christ for those sins that were imputed to him. Now, imputation is a purely legal transaction. It's distinct from infusion. When the penal substitution theorist says that our sins are imputed to Christ, he doesn't mean that Christ becomes literally wicked, selfish, immoral, lustful, and so forth. It is a purely legal verdict which is pronounced upon Christ, that he is held liable and guilty for the sins which we have committed, even though he remains personally a virtuous, loving, compassionate, and holy person. So, the question of penal substitution, it seems to me, comes down to the question of the coherence of the doctrine of the imputation of sins. And we'll begin to look at that doctrine next time we're together.